The Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci is the most famous painting in the world. But despite its legendary status, few are aware that it was once stolen from the Louvre and was considered lost for 2 years.
It was a sensational thing when it happened. Many people have forgotten that, and not many people know about it.
In 1911, an unknown intruder made his way into the museum and left with one of Europe's greatest treasures.
The museum opened, the crowd started coming in, and people started noticing the empty space on the wall.
A frantic effort was made to recover this priceless work of art, but the police had few leads to go on. Newspapers around the world ran theories of who was behind the theft, from wealthy industrialists to enemy nations.
At the time, it was all over the place. It was the biggest news story of its day.
It wouldn't have been stolen if it didn't have some remarkable status, but clearly that got worldwide coverage, front page of newspapers.
It really catches people's imagination of having something completely priceless in a very normal kind of domestic situation.
Little did they know that it was hidden in a small apartment in the city the whole time.
If people throughout the world, but particularly in Western civilization, were to say what was the most famous painting, they would say the Mona Lisa. So the theft of it is probably the most easily recognizable theft.
It's a very Thomas Crown affair thing, isn't it? It's the thrill of the chase.
The story of how the Mona Lisa was eventually recovered is just one of the many mysteries surrounding the painting. And in fact, even though Leonardo da Vinci has an unsurpassed reputation, many of his works surprisingly went missing after he died and have had to survive similarly precarious journeys. The search continues to this day to find all of the lost works of the quintessential Renaissance man. The Mona Lisa has always been a painting surrounded in mystery. Ever since the day Leonardo da Vinci first painted it in Florence in around 1503, it's generated quite the reputation.
Certainly, it was a very, very important painting when he was alive, and it was very influential. It was admired, and particularly what caught people's imagination was the technique that he used in order to turn that face into something a little more mysterious than the average painting.
What Leonardo is incredibly good at and very innovative in portraits is suggesting the portrait is looking at something. What he's immensely interested in is how the eyes communicate. He called them windows of the soul.
When Leonardo was painting it, artists, his contemporaries, all flocked to see it because it was so new and so unique and so different than anything, and it proved to be a real inspiration to them, especially someone like Raphael, who modeled, I know, one of his paintings after this, with a similar look and also had the same positioning as the Mona Lisa.
Leonardo became so attached to the painting himself that he was unable to part with it during his lifetime.
There's a lot of discussion why Leonardo never parted with the Mona Lisa during his lifetime. I don't think anyone has any clear-cut answers to that. Some people think that he simply just didn't finish it, and that he took it with him because he was a very slow, methodical worker. Plus, he got distracted by a lot of other things.
He was, as usual, distracted by other commissions. Took about probably 4 years or maybe longer, and through distraction, different travels, he took it with him and never parted from it.
For over a century, the Mona Lisa had been one of the greatest treasures held in the Louvre in Paris. But in 1911, it would vanish without trace.
In the early 1900s, museums like the Louvre weren't so worried about things like theft as they were about fire. That's one of the reasons why the paintings were never bolted to the walls. They were always hung loosely so that they could be removed in case of an emergency. There was also a lot of vandalism that was taking place. People unhappy with their lives, unhappy with their economic situation, would protest by going into the state-run Louvre and desecrate some of the paintings. People would actually stab paintings with scissors and with knives to protest. So the Louvre decided that they needed to take some action. So they wanted to put all the major masterpieces behind glass. And a lot of people were up in arms, but the Louvre saw no other way to protect these great works of art. And Vincenzo Peruggia was one of the 5 men sent to the Louvre to work on the paintings, who helped cut and clean the glass.
But Vincenzo Peruggia had hatched a plan to steal the Mona Lisa, and on the 21st of August 1911, he put his plan into action.
Vincenzo Peruggia was not what you'd call a common criminal or one of these suave, sophisticated art thieves that you see in the films. He was an immigrant workman. He was born in a town called Dumenza, Italy, and he would emigrate every year to France, and specifically to Paris, to work. Peruggia was a painter-decorator. He was the oldest son. He had 3 brothers and a sister and his parents, and work was hard to come by in Italy, and he was the oldest who went out and tried to provide for his family.
This was not the first time that the Mona Lisa had been taken out of the Louvre. None other than Napoleon Bonaparte had once had the painting moved from the Louvre into one of his bedrooms during his reign as emperor. And it was this connection with Napoleon that spurred Vincenzo Peruggia to action.
Vincenzo Peruggia seemed to have thought Napoleon looted it, and he looted lots of things from Italy, and indeed the Leonardo manuscripts in the Institut de France, still in France, a Napoleonic loot.
One day, Peruggia was waiting to start the job, and he picked up a book that was lying around in the workroom, and he saw this great caravan of statues and paintings that were being brought to France by Napoleon's army. He came to think that all the Italian artwork in the Louvre had been stolen by Napoleon.
He was thinking not that Francis I had bought this years ago and actually had a reasonable claim to it, but that it was stolen property, and he seems to have believed that.
Peruggia really thought that it was Napoleon who had taken the painting, as he had stolen many other paintings. So it was a patriotic act. He was returning the painting to its original country.
He got the idea that he was going to take a painting back to Italy. And if he did, well, he'd be a hero, and maybe the government would give him some money.
And it was his belief that he was going to do the Italian country a favor.
Vincenzo Peruggia had stolen the Mona Lisa on a Monday morning, but it was not until Tuesday that the museum realized it was missing. When word got out, it would cause a sensation around the world, but especially on the streets of Paris. With one of her greatest treasures now vanished, it was the talk of the town, and rumors spread like wildfire.
On Tuesday, when the painting disappeared, and the police came, searched the Louvre, found the empty frame, they knew that something was wrong. The newspapers break the story of the Mona Lisa being stolen. And this news rocks Paris. In fact, it goes all around the world. This was when newspapers were probably at their peak. Literally millions of copies of every newspaper were printed every day, and this was front page news story.
Everyone loves the story of a heist or an art theft. It's incredibly exciting. I think everyone has that feeling when you walk into a museum. I remember being a child and kind of wanting to wonder what would happen if you pulled a painting off the wall. Everyone is fascinated by it. And I think even in 1911, they would close all the ports. There were police everywhere.
So in the grand discussion of who the suspects were, a lot of people pointed their fingers at wealthy Americans. Because at the time, Americans were very much on the hunt for European artwork. And J.P. Morgan was probably at the top of the list. He was certainly, if not the wealthiest man in the world, one of them. And he was spending a lot of that wealth on bringing to America the great treasures of Europe. There were certain camps that had their own theories about exactly what was wrong. The prefect of Paris police, a man named Louis Lepine, very famous at the time. In fact, some newspapers had called him the greatest policeman in the world. His theory was that the painting was taken by an agent of a foreign power who was going to blackmail the Louvre for cash or for other political reasons, or he thought it was just a disgruntled employee.
With World War I just around the corner, it was no surprise that Germany was seen as a potential culprit for the crime.
There were other conspiracy theories. Some people thought that the Germans, who were the enemies of the French, sent an agent in to steal France's greatest treasure in order to provoke war. Everybody was trying to come up with their own angle of where the painting was.
But only one man in the world knew where the Mona Lisa was being held: Vincenzo Peruggia. And while he kept the painting in his Paris apartment, all sorts of people were accused of the crime. The finger was even pointed at a young artist just making a name for himself in Paris, Pablo Picasso. He soon found himself in the firing line. Vincenzo Peruggia had successfully pulled off the heist of the century, thanks to some weak security at the Louvre and a slice of good fortune. But Peruggia had been misinformed about the Mona Lisa's history. His audacious plan may have been successful, but he was incorrect in his belief that Napoleon had once looted the painting. Its rightful home was not in Italy, but in the Louvre in Paris, where he had taken it from. Leonardo himself had spent the last 3 years of his life in the employment of King Francis I of France. Having started the Mona Lisa in around 1503, Leonardo was never fully satisfied with the painting, and 13 years later took it with him to the French royal court. It is said that King Francis joined Leonardo on his deathbed. But what is known for certain is that the king purchased the Mona Lisa for more than a princely sum, and it was placed in the Palace of Fontainebleau. During the French Revolution, it found itself the property of the people of France and was placed in the Louvre. But that didn't stop Napoleon from claiming the painting for himself.
The Mona Lisa did hang above Napoleon's bed for a while. It was after that returned to the Louvre, to what became then the Louvre of the people of France when the monarchy was restored.
However, when the Mona Lisa was returned to its rightful home, it wasn't exactly the center of attention, as this painting by Samuel Morse demonstrates. Vincenzo Peruggia was stuck with a masterpiece in his apartment and no plans for what to do with it. While he tried to lay low, the rest of Paris remained captivated by the theft of one of the city's greatest treasures.
This was a front-page news story, and it lasted not for hours or days or weeks, but months, and actually, ultimately 2.5 years. This was still in the paper with people looking for the Mona Lisa.
It wouldn't have been stolen if it didn't have some remarkable status, but clearly that got worldwide coverage for the photographs of people queuing to see the gap.
People queued up to look at the empty wall in the Louvre and look at the pegs that were up on the wall. So it became much more famous at the time.
You know, even Kafka went to go and have a look at the wall. So it definitely was almost kind of a tourist attraction as the empty space of the Mona Lisa, and I'm sure that did, you know, up the profile. I mean, at the end of the day, it's Da Vinci.
Then eventually, the Parisians, in their way, started making jokes. There was a series of funny postcards put out saying, where is the Mona Lisa today? And on one, she's in London playing the guitar in front of Big Ben. And another, she's shopping in downtown Paris. Her image started appearing on cookie boxes, tobacco tins. The Mona Lisa became a commodity because of the fame. And a lot of people say that it is the fame of the theft that made the Mona Lisa as well known as she is today.
The police tried desperately to catch the culprit, and one of those accused of the crime was Pablo Picasso, who had recently made a name for himself in the art world. Both he and his close friend Guillaume Apollinaire fell under suspicion, especially since Apollinaire had once claimed that the Louvre should be burnt to the ground.
Apollinaire's real name was Guillaume Kostrawicki. He was of Polish descent, but he lived in Paris. He made his name in Paris. He was very well known. Pablo Picasso was just starting to make a name for himself in the art world.
He was an artist that had really embraced life in Paris, and that had been really formative in the beginnings of his fame, which he was obviously already getting there. You know, he had done Demoiselle, it had been an absolute outrage, but he was becoming a pretty famous guy by that point.
Apollinaire and Picasso were accused of the theft of the Mona Lisa, partly because Picasso had been found in the possession of some statuettes, Iberian statuettes, that had been stolen from the Louvre.
I didn't know he still had them.
The finger was pointed because he did already own, in inverted commas, pieces of work which were taken from the Louvre, so it was an obvious implication of Picasso.
Pablo, what are you doing?
Your friend is a liar.
The police wanted to know how Picasso had these stolen statues from the Louvre in his possession. Well, Picasso had bought them, but he didn't know that they were stolen.
He is jealous. I never bought the statues. I've never seen the statues.
He bought them from this man who sold them for just a few pounds. Now, the man happened to be an assistant of Apollinaire.
We'll throw them in the river.
Pablo,
No one will know they were here.
just calm down.
This is your fault. You introduced us. They'll have me deported for this. Don't you see?
Picasso used these two Iberian statues as models, as inspiration for one of his famous paintings at the time, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So Picasso had used this as inspiration. In fact, he still had these statues in a closet in his apartment. So when the news broke, Picasso started to be a little worried about this.
This is ridiculous.
Just give me a moment.
We should just get rid of them now.
We'd be seen. Pablo, we just have to wait. It'll be dark soon. Come on. You're winning.
I don't see why we're playing this stupid game.
Picasso and Apollinaire were so spooked that Apollinaire went to the newspaper and confessed. He was arrested. Picasso was brought in for questioning. He was held, not charged, and released. Apollinaire sat in jail for 8 days. Police thought that there was an international gang of art thieves behind the theft of the Mona Lisa. He was ultimately released because there was no proof.
Apollinaire had declared that in his quest for modernity, the Louvre should be burned. So I suppose the two things joined in, particularly the theft of the statuettes, but they were released very, very soon.
It wasn't his home, it wasn't his culture or country, so to be seen as kind of stealing pieces of work which belonged to the nation probably wasn't ideal.
Apollinaire was so damaged by the fact that his loyalty to France was called into question that he volunteered to fight in the war, and he became injured through shrapnel and eventually died. So because of the theft of the Mona Lisa and the scandalous accusation that Apollinaire had to live through, the theft of the Mona Lisa, you could say, killed Apollinaire.
While Picasso and Apollinaire fell under suspicion, the real culprit, Vincenzo Peruggia, had become restless and made an attempt to sell the painting on. He contacted Alfredo Geri, an art dealer in Florence, claiming he wanted to return the Mona Lisa to Italy.
Alfredo Geri was an art dealer in Florence, Italy. He was a well-known dealer at the time, owning an art auction house. He had placed ads in a lot of newspapers saying he was looking for antiques to buy. One of the ads he placed was in an Italian paper that Peruggia read in Paris. He wrote him a letter. He said, "Signor Getty, I have the Mona Lisa, and it is my fond wish to bring it to Italy, where I hope it will remain in the Uffizi Gallery forever."
He chose to sign his letter with the name Leonardo.
So Getty gets this letter, and he looks at it going, all right, this is a joke, this is crazy, I'm gonna throw this away. But then he has second thoughts.
Came this morning.
So what Getty does is go see Giovanni Poggi. Poggi is the director of the Uffizi Gallery, Florence's biggest museum. If Peruggia wants to return the Mona Lisa to the Uffizi, he's got to have the permission of Poggi.
Another copy, I would imagine. Right back. Inform him you wish to examine the painting before buying. Let's bring Leonardo back to Florence.
The Mona Lisa was finally close to being recovered. Peruggia would take the painting on a train from Paris to meet Alfredo Geri and Giovanni Poggi, looking for a handsome reward for the return of the Mona Lisa. Vincenzo Peruggia had stolen the Mona Lisa in August 1911, leaving the Paris police baffled. He had kept the painting hidden in his apartment for 2 years, unsure of his next move. During this time, accusations were thrown around the city and people began to lose hope of a recovery. But in 1913, Peruggia finally decided to act when he attempted to sell the painting in Florence. He had arranged to meet with an art dealer called Alfredo Geri. Both he and the director of the Uffizi Gallery, Giovanni Poggi, didn't know what to expect.
Come in.
Signor Geri? Leonardo? Yes. You have the object? She's safe. Don't worry. Can we see it?
They all walk over to the hotel. They climb the stairs to Peruggia's room. They're both looking at each other, Geri and Poggi, going, what have we gotten into? You know, this guy's staying in this flea bag hotel. He doesn't look like anybody who could pull off this crime. But we're here. They go into the room, and he opens the trunk. He starts taking all this junk out of the trunk. His mandolin, old shoes, his paintbrushes, old clothes. He removes the false bottom, and under there is an object wrapped in red cloth.
There.
Poggi's thinking, this is the real painting. So he calmly tells Peruggia, well, I've got to do more tests on this. You know, I've got to inspect this a little closer at the Uffizi. Can we take it back to the museum? And Peruggia says yes. So they go back to the Uffizi, and Poggi brings out some big photographs that he has of the Mona Lisa.
I simply did what any patriotic Italian would have done. I brought her home. You do expect to be paid, though, I assume.
If the government were to reward my duty with some small gift, it would be wrong of me to refuse. I want 500,000 lira.
It's a 400-year-old painting at this time, and the varnish on the painting has been cracked over the years. Sure, you can forge the Mona Lisa, but there's no way you're going to replicate each one of those thousands and thousands of cracks.
If it's real.
It's real. There are marks on this no forger could know.
It's real.
So Poggi's comparing the photograph with the actual Mona Lisa. and he thinks that it's legitimate. And they tell Peruggia to go back to his hotel, that they'll be in touch.
Satisfied they had the real thing, Geri and Poggi contacted the police. And Vincenzo Peruggia was arrested for the art theft of the century.
The news of the recovery of the Mona Lisa breaks worldwide. The news of its recovery is even bigger than the news of its theft.
His apartment in Paris, where he hid the painting for so long, was extensively searched by the police. Amazingly, Peruggia only served a few months in jail and became a hero to many in Italy for his actions.
I've looked at the testimony in court and so on, and I think he's a pretty dysfunctional guy. You wouldn't say that he was somebody who pursued things in very logical sequences, and I think, yeah, probably the initial motive, he always claimed that he thought Napoleon had looted it from Italy.
I think Peruggia came out with this nonsense about Napoleon at some point, not realizing that there had been a king in France called Francis I. It so happened the king had asked Leonardo for a painting and bought it from him.
I think people love to get behind their own. You know, Da Vinci is obviously one of the most iconic artists that there is in Italy, and, you know, to be taken by Italian and returned, or, you know, be in the hands of an Italian seizing it to return it to its natural home, I think is probably a kind of quite a romantic idea that people like, you know, they got behind and kind of took interest in the story.
Peruggia was celebrated somewhat. In Florence, people sent money to Peruggia. In jail, they sent gifts to him. People offered to pay his bail. So in some ways, you know, he was a hero that way. But eventually all that wore off. He was arrested in December 1913. He was put on trial in June 1914. They were perilously close to the First World War. People had other things in mind other than the trial of the man who stole the Mona Lisa.
The simple truth is that idiotic trophy art heists get you nowhere if you're the criminal, and they're a pain in the backside to law enforcement authorities because they just go on and on and on. They cost money. It's worse for the criminals themselves. They haven't a clue what to do.
Before the Mona Lisa was returned to the Louvre, it was sent on a tour of Italy. Since then, its only other foreign visits have been to Moscow, Tokyo, and the US, where it was presented by President Kennedy.
One of Washington's most distinguished throngs is at the National Gallery of Art to welcome a distinguished visitor. President and Mrs. Kennedy, with French Cultural Minister André Malraux and his wife, pay homage to the first public appearance of Mona Lisa, the Leonardo da Vinci painting that has captured the fancy of generations for 400 years.
When it went to New York, it had a kind of royal reception with J.F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy.
Mr. Minister, we in the United States are grateful for this loan from the leading artistic power in the world, France.
The Mona Lisa's only been out of France 3 times, Moscow and Tokyo. In 1963, when the French government loaned her to the United States, where she was displayed in New York and in Washington, D.C., and in 1913, when Vincenzo Peruggia took her to Italy.
It was allowed out for a short time, but it's been in the Louvre securely for a long time, and it's only allowed out once a year when it's checked out for its condition.
And rest assured, security now is a lot tighter than it was back in 1911.
She hasn't been out that much, and one of those times was by the man who stole her. You can't justify it. You can't say that it was ever a good thing, but the outcome of it were good things. Museums knew now, if a painting is removed from the wall, put a little tag on the wall that says that the painting is somewhere else. Security was bolstered. It really opened up a whole new world of what a painting like the Mona Lisa could do.
There are lots of stories about stealing art and famous pieces of art. It seems impossible that one should do it because they're so well known. Another painting by Leonardo that was stolen, the Madonna of the Yarnwinder, that was stolen from the Duke of Buccleuch's collection in Scotland.
The Madonna of the Yarnwinder was taken in a daring heist in 2003. The painting was hanging in Drumlanrig Castle when a gang of 4 men took it at knife point in broad daylight.
The police contacted me and said, let's talk about the picture and what do we do if we recover it? How do we tell it's Leonardo? I was able to tell the police I've got good forensic evidence which are not available to the thief. So if they attempted to replicate the painting and give you back the replica, then I can tell you, and they rather liked that.
As the months turned into years, it was feared to have been lost to the criminal underworld.
The Duke asked me my advice about what he really ought to do to get the picture back, to protect his collection. And I explained my reasons to him, and so he thanked me for my advice. The Strathclyde police were trying a covert operation to recover the painting. The important thing is to get the picture back, and they got it back.
The painting was recovered in 2007 from thieves who were trying to use it as collateral as part of other illegal operations.
I got a call from the police saying, there's been developments, can you help us? And after a bit I went up to Edinburgh, and the picture was then in the conservation studios of the National Galleries of Scotland being examined. And you could walk into the room and I could say, oh yeah, that's the original, but we could reconstruct evidence of the underdrawing. So again, it helped the police to have something which wasn't just an art historian coming in and saying, yeah, that's obviously Leonardo. There was really hard evidence that this was the real thing.
But why do people steal famous works of art that they could never sell on?
We know that there are reasons for stealing works of art that are to do with using them as collaterals for drug purposes or for money laundering or for criminal purposes. So it's less to do with a wealthy individual keeping the painting for themselves, some sort of obsession with the work of art, and it's probably more to do with big criminal acts, except for the case of Peruggia, of course.
The story of Vincenzo Peruggia's theft is only one of the mysterious events surrounding the Mona Lisa and all of Leonardo's works. It's been a battle to try and hunt down the very few paintings he worked on in his life, many of which went missing over the centuries. In fact, in just the last few years, 2 previously unknown works were unveiled that many claim are by Leonardo's hand. The Mona Lisa was lost for a period of 2 years before it was gratefully recovered in 1913. But many other of Leonardo's paintings have gone missing for a lot longer than that. In fact, in just the last few years, 2 previously unknown works were unveiled. Based at Oxford University, Professor Martin Kemp, the leading international authority on the Renaissance genius, led the team that authenticated the first work of art by Leonardo to appear for over a century. La Bella Principessa.
I get sent new Leonardos more regularly than I care to confess, and most of them are pretty absurd. You get some things which are promising, that you think, well, that's school of Leonardo or maybe by a pupil. This came through as a quite decent quality digital file, and I thought it's almost too good to be true. It's very pretty, very beautifully executed, but you always say, don't believe it. You go in, or you should go in, with an enormous amount of skepticism. With Leonardo, it's very difficult because he tackled almost every project as a one-off. It seems every painting, every project he did, he thought it through, if not from the ground upwards. He certainly thought about new ways of doing it, new media, and so on.
There was an added layer of intrigue with this drawing, as it was on vellum, a medium that is not part of any other known work by Leonardo.
The fact it was on vellum cuts both ways. We know that Leonardo is very experimental in his media, and it's very difficult to say he did not use vellum. But equally, the fact, if you were doing something which you were pretending to be Leonardo, a deliberate deception, you wouldn't choose that medium, which makes life difficult for you. But I did know that Leonardo discussed working on vellum, so it wasn't a total surprise.
Only a handful of paintings are universally accepted to be by Leonardo da Vinci's hand. Scholars argue over the attribution of many of the paintings, and La Bella Principessa is no different.
If we look at Leonardo's work, only The Last Supper has a continuous history, which is a surprise. You think the Mona Lisa has and so on, but they all have breaks in their provenance, i.e. the history of who owned them. So each one comes out in a somewhat different way.
Amazingly, right after La Bella Principessa was found, yet another work has been attributed to Leonardo, the Salvator Mundi. After its attribution, it sold for over $70 million.
We had drawings of the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo. We had masses of copies, and the picture had been completely overpainted. It's painted on walnut panel, which had warped over time. It tented, i.e. the grain pushed up. And somebody simply took a plane or some shaving device and they shaved off the ridges. So it's very badly damaged. Somebody completely overpainted it. Looking back now on the black and white photographs, you can see areas which say this is worth looking at. But overall, I described it as looking at a drug-crazed hippie. And it's simply an unattractive thing. Once all the overpaint was stripped off, you could see that you've got a kind of archaeological version of a Leonardo, and it absolutely shouts Leonardo. It's been restored, that's to say the missing areas have been diplomatically filled in.
Just like the Salvator Mundi, other works by Leonardo that have had to find their way back into his canon include The Lady with an Ermine, the Benoit Madonna, and the Ginevra di Benci. But there may be yet another hiding behind a wall in Florence, the Battle of Anghiari.
I've always been fascinated with Leonardo, mostly because of not only his great successes, but his great failures. And one of his great failures is the Battle of Anghiari, this massive mural of one of the battles in Italian or Florentine history that he had painted, but because he used a new technique, the paint wasn't adhering to the walls.
He was notorious for trying out different techniques, and so the fresco painting requires a specific keying into the actual fresh plaster.
Leonardo tried to dry the paint by putting these large urns with fire at the base of the great mural to dry the paint, but instead of drying it, it caused all the paint to run.
That technique was an haphazard technique. I mean, he was experimental. That's really what he was doing. He was a scientist as well as an artist.
We still have the preparatory studies that Leonardo da Vinci made for the Battle of Anghiari, as well as a copy made by Peter Paul Rubens in 1603. But the original remains elusive.
Some people think that it's still being preserved and thinks behind another painting in the Palazzo Vecchio, painting done by Vasari.
The Battle of Anghiari research has been going on since the late 1970s in one form or another, and at one point a bit of plaster was removed from the wall and disclosed nothing. Maurizio Serracini's search has got entangled in Florentine politics, and Florentine politics are, in the art world, hideously complicated.
Well, the Battle of Anghiari was definitely painted on the walls of the Palazzo Vecchio, so we have documentation for that. In fact, we know that Leonardo started it the year he started the Mona Lisa, in 1503. But unlikely that it will be found.
There are clues in Vasari's painting that behind this, there's Leonardo's masterpiece. He says, I think in one of the flags in the painting, it says, "Seek and ye shall find." So this Italian art historian, had been drilling holes in inobtrusive places in the Vasari to put cameras in, and he's seen things behind there that he thinks are paint from the time of Leonardo.
If it is in a space between these two walls, that there's the wall on which Leonardo painted and there's the wall on which Vasari painted, and I'm not convinced there's really much of a gap between them.
Various searches to find the painting under the wall have really not led to any results yet. So I think it's unlikely, even though quite a lot of people are interested in searching for it.
I hope they find the Battle of Anghiari. It would be just incredible. It would be the largest Leonardo ever found.
The struggle continues to see if the Battle of Anghiari has survived. And while that painting may not have been recovered, people continue to claim that new works by Leonardo have been found. There has even been a claim that an earlier version of the Mona Lisa was unearthed.
There was a huge trumpeted announcement of the discovery of the first version of the Mona Lisa. Not very pretty on canvas, and it was owned by somebody who lived in Isleworth. So it's known as the Isleworth Mona Lisa, which I don't want to be rude about Isleworth, but it's not the most probable place to find the Mona Lisa. And it was accompanied by this big book with gold-edged, very fat, with masses of so-called evidence. I see quite a lot of Leonardo attributions which come with fat folios of stuff. And it's almost as if you accumulate enough pages and you have enough scientific analysis, enough graphs, enough pigment analysis and so on that somehow proves something. I think you can demonstrate fairly clearly it belongs to one of a small family of copies. I'd be interested in finding out more about it, but not under the coercion that it has to be an early version of the Mona Lisa.
In 2012, another Mona Lisa story broke when a copy of the painting was discovered at the Prado Museum in Spain. It was displayed at the Louvre and is thought to be by one of Leonardo's pupils, and therefore the earliest known copy of the original painting. Leonardo da Vinci had many admirers during his lifetime, and his masterpieces were extensively copied by his pupils, the Leonardeschi. These copies are still being unearthed, but could any more lost works by the master himself ever turn up?
As far as other discoveries go of completely new material, you can't rule that out.
It's not very usual that they're found. It's quite slow finding Leonardos, even though there are lots of people who maintain all the time that they're around.
It's wonderful that in recent times we've uncovered these new Leonardos. He didn't do that much work, and to find new things is remarkable.
The last painting before the Salvator Mundi to be discovered was early 20th century. That's the Vermeer Madonna in St. Petersburg and Hermitage in Russia. I'm working on an internet edition of the Leonardo manuscript owned by Bill Gates. Remarkably, if you look at the thousands of existing pages really hard, you still discover new things.
But while more works by Leonardo da Vinci may eventually be found someday, no recovery could be quite as remarkable as the story of Vincenzo Peruggia and the theft of the Mona Lisa. The painting continues to cast its spell over the world.
This is a famous painting. It's a mystery, it's an icon. It's one of the few things on Earth that practically everyone on Earth knows. And for that, she's celebrated and in demand.
I think there probably is something in that is incredibly enigmatic. You know, there is that smile and there is something quite almost entertaining about stealing that painting, because that's part of the interest in it, is the mystery.
The act of stealing the painting and the fact that the painting was absent made the painting obviously much more famous.
The theft remains a very dramatic story, but it's one of many stories around the Mona Lisa, many legends, many true stories, and so on.
She's still in the news. You know, every couple of weeks, they're digging up the body of the person they think is the Mona Lisa. There's another theory. There was just something that says the copy of the Mona Lisa that's in the Prado was done at the same time, and if you put them together, it's a 3D image. This is 500 years later after she's been painted, and she's still getting press.
Vermeer is the ultimate enigma. He created some of the world's most treasured paintings, including The Girl with a Pearl Earring. But we know very little about him. In fact, for 2 centuries, his masterpieces were largely forgotten. But an intrepid French explorer in the 19th century managed to hunt them down in hidden locations, where they'd been scattered across Europe.
You don't hear people making these pilgrimages for most artists. And what is it about Vermeer that encourages this need?
Slowly but surely, Vermeer came to be appreciated for the artistic genius that he was.
Vermeer is one of the most enigmatic Dutch artists of the 17th century.
Once you see a Vermeer, you never forget it. And you never forget where you saw it.
However, the process of reclaiming his paintings has been fraught with peril. One of the most successful forgers of all time, Han van Meegeren, managed to fool the experts for years with his collection of fake Vermeers. His trial was a media sensation that rocked the art world.
It seems astonishing to us now that we were fooled by the Van Meegeren fakes.
It's wishful thinking. You really want a painting to be Vermeer. If you just want it, you know, it will be.
He was just a brilliant psychologist, and he understood that scholars would think, we've always been expecting to find these, and here they are.
There are very few genuine Vermeers around, and many have been lost to us once again, being stolen by members of the IRA and the Boston mob.
It would appear that they were very selective in what they took.
Even Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering were looking to get their hands on Vermeers by whatever means necessary. Hitler managed to get a hold of 2. Goering was sold a fake, made by Van Meegeren. The forgeries have made life difficult when it comes to the work of the Dutch master.
If you would discover a genuine Vermeer, it would make your day, but you have to be really careful.
It's been an epic struggle to reclaim the works of Johannes Vermeer from their hidden locations and from the thieves that took them. That struggle continues today. At the end of World War II, Joseph Piller, a Jewish resistance hero, was tasked with hunting down SS and Gestapo members after the liberation of the Netherlands. He also managed to track down Han van Meegeren, a very wealthy resident of Amsterdam who he discovered had been behind the sales of many recently rediscovered Vermeers. But one of those sales had been made to the Nazi leader Hermann Goering, and van Meegeren was accused of collaboration.
Are you going to answer the question, Mr. Van Meegeren?
My father told me I would never amount to anything.
He didn't approve of your career?
I know nothing, he used to say. I'm capable of nothing.
Well, he was wrong, wasn't he? A man doesn't acquire 50 houses.
52.
Yes, 52. You had to be clever to do what you did.
Yes.
Where did they come from, Mr. Van Meegeren? Where did you find the Vermeers?
But what Piller didn't know was that Van Meegeren was one of the most successful art forgers of all time. Just like Johannes Vermeer himself, Van Meegeren lived and worked in the city of Delft and was also an artist. But he was chastised by art critics at the time. They said his style was just an imitation of the old masters. Van Meegeren decided to retaliate by proving that he could imitate them so accurately that even the experts would be fooled.
I think he had 2 motives. One was obviously money. It was a way of earning some money by making these fakes. But I also think he wanted to get his own back on the art world. They didn't like his art, so he thought he would do something to get his own back on the critics.
Van Meegeren was a Dutch Delft architect who has made some buildings in Delft as well. So around Delft you will find some real Van Meegerens. There are buildings alongside canals. Van Meegeren discovered he could make wonderful Vermeers with the kind of paint Vermeer used in his time. And people from that area liked it very much and thought the possibility to own a real Vermeer.
Han van Meegeren made forgeries of other artists. But it was the fact that Johannes Vermeer was such a mystery that allowed these fakes to be so successful. Johannes Vermeer was born in Delft in 1632, exactly 300 years before Van Meegeren started his fakes. He joined the Artistic Guild of St. Luke and may have been taught by another celebrated artist who worked in Delft, Karel Fabricius. Fabricius was Rembrandt's greatest pupil, but was tragically killed at the age of 32 when a gunpowder store exploded in Delft, destroying much of the city. The event became known as the Delft Thunderclap. Vermeer survived the gunpowder explosion and started working on his paintings, including A View of Delft, made 6 years after the tragedy.
We know very little about his life. He actually ran an inn or tavern in the town of Delft outside The Hague.
The city of Delft in the 17th century was very rich. We did business all over the world. Wonderful buildings, already stone, but also a lot of wooden houses.
He was a Dutch Golden Age painter, that great flowering of the Dutch Republic.
We think Vermeer was in the middle class of people. His mother-in-law was very rich, of course. His father had two inns.
It always sounds as though he suffered from his father, who had been a cloth worker and dealer, and became a tavern keeper and killed a soldier and was generally sounds like a rogue. Married a Catholic, had 15 children, 11 of which survived. One imagines his life didn't look anything like a Vermeer. Maybe that was the point.
We have no definitive pictures of Johannes Vermeer, but it's believed by scholars that he may have painted himself into one of his early works, the Procurus.
It's a genre scene where you have a figure in the background and he looks like a painter and, he may be Vermeer. I like to think it is Vermeer, but, we don't know that for sure.
Vermeer may also have painted himself into one of his later works, The Art of Painting.
He had other jobs, so, he earned his money as a painter, but he had an inn and he dealt in art, so he was an art dealer.
He had 11 children with his wife. He was also an innkeeper. He had the two inns of his father. He was a seller of antiques and that kind of things. And he was a painter as well.
How the poor man found time to paint at all is a miracle.
Some very successful artists, like Rembrandt, had a studio and employed a lot of assistants who would work doing some menial task. But Vermeer seems to have worked just by himself, and that's probably a reflection of both of the way he wanted to work and the fact that he didn't earn very much money.
There's a great idea that great suffering makes great art.
Vermeer's unique way of working and the materials he used seem to explain why there are so precious few examples of his paintings in the world today.
I think it's a combination of two reasons why we have such a very small output. One is that we simply don't have the paintings, that they were lost, because of course a lot of pictures do get lost, and some of his must have done. The other thing is he probably did work very slowly. I mean, they're very meticulously and carefully painted.
He painted using lapis lazuli quite a lot, and he painted gem-like pictures that were made out of gems often.
Vermeer used very expensive colors, the stone lapis lazuli. In those years, it was very expensive.
Because he produced so little, he probably didn't earn a great deal. And there were also economic problems in the Netherlands at the time. And when he died, he was in debt.
Vermeer died in Delft at the age of just 43. His reputation as an artist did not extend much beyond his hometown, and his name faded into obscurity very quickly, along with his paintings. It was not until almost 2 centuries later that he finally got the recognition that he deserved, when a French exile made it his mission to bring Vermeer to the world. Johannes Vermeer lived and painted in the city of Delft near The Hague. But his reputation as an artist didn't extend much beyond the city he worked in. And when he died at the age of 43, it seemed Vermeer had missed his chance to be considered one of history's greatest artists.
I don't imagine that his pictures sold for much, and there weren't very many of them. If you're painting probably 2 pictures a year, that's not like being Picasso.
In those times, Rembrandt and some other painters also in Delft, from Mierveld and Pieter de Hoog, for instance, sold a lot more paintings to other people than Vermeer did.
The volume of the work available is a key component in this. Even accounting for ones that may have been lost or destroyed even, it's still a relatively small output for someone who was an artist for over 20 years.
In those years, it was not very common to like a Vermeer. The prices which were paid on the selling in Amsterdam were also not so very high, for instance.
There were no paintings by Vermeer in French public collections. I think the Vermeer in the Mauritshuis was the first Vermeer to enter a public collection in the Netherlands. So if you have these paintings in private collections, if you had good contacts, you could go there, but it's different from a museum.
There were few collectors of his work, and they were saved by them. Often they were later attributed to other artists, not to Vermeer. And then Vermeer was rediscovered in the mid-19th century.
Vermeer's rediscovery was due to a French exile named Théophile Thoré, who found himself captivated by the paintings. Thoré made it his life's work to track down as many Vermeers as he could. It wasn't going to be an easy task, though. After Vermeer's death, his paintings had scattered across Europe and were often incorrectly listed as the work of far better-known artists at the time. Many of them would end up in royal possession. In 1742, a girl reading a letter by an open window was acquired for Augustus III, the King of Poland, with the belief that it was a painting by Rembrandt. The music lesson was also bought by a king in 1762 when it was purchased for King George III of England. It entered the royal collection at Buckingham Palace, where it was listed as being by Frans van Mieris. In 1802, the guitar player became the property of Lord Palmerston, who would go on to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The art of painting, Vermeer's most treasured item that he always kept in his possession, would end up being listed as a work by Pieter de Hoogh. It travelled to Vienna, where it became part of the House of Czernin collection in 1813. The Little Street and the Milkmaid stayed in the Netherlands, though, when they entered the collection of the aristocratic Dutch family, the Sixes, at the House of Six in Amsterdam.
Vermeer?
Jan Vermeer. I had never heard the name before either, but it was simply astonishing. The first one I saw was at The Hague. The brilliance of the light, the intensity of the colour, both real and utterly original. I had to know who painted it.
He went to the Mauritshuis in The Hague in 1842, saw this huge panorama on Delft, and, well, he was blown away immediately by this incredible painting.
The view of Delft is an amazing picture, very beautifully painted. I can see that it was a landscape which would certainly have appealed to people in the 19th century.
I searched every gallery in Holland I knew, every one. I found 2 more in private collections. Again, simply astounding work. This was art concerned with the real. Servants at work. The town where he lived, unadorned. This was art for man.
He traveled all over the place and discovered new paintings. The only thing I can get to know him is by reading what he left us, and it's almost a diary of his travels.
He drew up a list of works which he felt were by Vermeer and identified quite a lot of them for the first time.
We had wondered what you got up to during your time away. A mistress or two, my brother thought. We never thought you'd fallen in love.
Love is selfish, Isaac. I could not keep Vermeer to myself. In fact, that was the reason I asked you here.
Isaac Pereire was a wealthy Parisian financier and art collector. Thoré hoped that he could convince Pereire to purchase one of the Vermeers he'd found. It was 1866, and Thoré was publishing his findings in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts.
This was for him like the starting point for, like, you have a Rembrandt research project, he had a Vermeer research project, and I think it took him the rest of his life to do this.
He wrote an article in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, which is a kind of groundbreaking essay on Vermeer, his oeuvre, and his life.
1866 is sort of the key date. He was published in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, which increased everyone's awareness of him as an artist, and of his works.
He really writes everything. How he went to The Hague, how he saw the painting, how he had never heard of Vermeer de Delft.
Thoré had actually bought several Vermeers for himself during his travels, but he was hoping that Pereire would purchase The Geographer to help establish Vermeer's name.
A Vermeer in your collection would transform the way people think of him. See how the scholar grips the book as if caught in the very moment of inspiration. He doesn't want to let it go. And his understanding of light, Isaac.
It is a very fine piece.
This doesn't do it justice. The scholar's cloak is blue, but the deepest blue you could imagine. You must have it. You must.
I'm sorry.
Pereire would soon be persuaded, though, and Vermeers would quickly become a must-have item for the world's wealthiest collectors.
Pereire was a very well-known collector. You have the publication in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, so all the connoisseurs read that. Of course, all the collectors read this. And if there is a new discovery of a new name, then of course everybody wants to own a Vermeer, and Pereire was no exception to that.
Why don't you buy it yourself?
The old master has demanded much of me. He needs new advocates now.
Well, he could have no finer ally. And none more persuasive. Show it to me again.
It was thanks to Thoré that we really rediscovered Vermeer, and that sort of put him on the map, if you like. And then he became very collectible in the 20th century.
But of course, at that time, it was very hard to come by. So these paintings were really expensive. And we know that at that time, even forgeries were made in the early 20th century.
Forgeries had started to appear, but real discoveries were still being made. Thoré had identified many of the Vermeers he found by the subtle and varying signatures that the artist used. That signature was then found on two paintings in the early 20th century, Diana and her companions and Christ in the house with Mary and Martha. They were very different from most of his known works, and if they didn't have signatures, it's unlikely they would ever have been attributed to Vermeer. Surprisingly, Vermeer's most famous work, The Girl with a Pearl Earring, was not identified by Thoré before he died in 1869. However, it had not gone unnoticed by those who had seen it.
The Girl with the Pearl Earring is a fascinating story, and as we know, was sold for like 6 guilders or something incredible. Actually, it turns out it was more recognized at that time than you would think, because it was, from very early on, really greatly admired by novelists. These are actually novelists who are writing stories about traveling through the Netherlands. Early on, it was recognized, and then slowly becomes written about among the art historians of the world.
The art historians believed that there were still more Vermeers to be found, though, especially from his early career. And Han van Meegeren saw an opportunity. His Vermeer fakes made in the 1930s were hugely successful, and his career as an art forger would have probably continued if he hadn't sold one of them to Hermann Goering.
Sir, Goering's man, he's been found.
Has he talked yet?
I don't know, sir. That's all we have.
Han van Meegeren, in a desperate attempt to save his own skin, was about to send the art world into a panic when he revealed his deception. He was put on trial where he had to prove himself guilty of forgery rather than face conviction of Nazi collaboration. When World War II came to an end, it was discovered that Hitler had stashed away many priceless artworks for his own private collection. He'd even managed to get hold of 2 Vermeers, including The Astronomer and The Art of Painting. Hermann Goering, it seemed, had also got hold of a Vermeer, and the trail led right back to Han van Meegeren.
Your German friend, Miedel, he's been arrested, hiding in Spain.
He's no friend of mine.
Well, he's had plenty to say about you.
Van Meegeren was accused of selling a painting to Goering and collaborating with the Nazis.
Unusually for Goering, he actually paid for it, a relatively decent sum of money from an art dealer who either genuinely believed that it was a Vermeer or must have been crapping his pants. I mean, really, knowing that you're selling a fake to Goering isn't a very safe thing to do.
And in order to avoid that charge, he said that he'd sold a fake. So this is how the whole thing came out into the open.
He says that you came to him, Goering's art dealer, with the sole purpose of doing business with the Nazis.
That is a lie.
You'll swear to it. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
On oath.
He's lying.
No, he isn't. The simple fact, Mr. Van Meegeren, is we don't need to talk to you anymore. This will convict you for collaboration. Though naturally, any cooperation you might offer at this point would be considered when it came to sentencing. Where did you get the Vermeers, Mr. Van Meegeren? Where did you take them from? Who helped you?
No one. No one helped me. I did it. I painted them. I painted them all.
Being accused of forgery was a far lesser crime than collaboration with the Nazis. But Van Meegeren would have to prove that these newly discovered Vermeers were, in fact, fakes. And so a trial was conducted where, oddly, Van Meegeren had to prove himself guilty rather than innocent of a crime.
It seems astonishing to us now that we were fooled by the Van Meegeren fakes. But they were accepted by some of the top experts in Dutch art, including Bredius. And once 1 or 2 experts had accepted it, the others seemed to.
The touch Van Meegeren used just not to make something Vermeer is very famous for, but making it look like it could be a Vermeer. People were so eager to have those paintings.
It is not easy to admit when you've been made a fool of. You laid a trap for us, Mr. Van Meegeren. It was a clever one, too. We wanted to walk into it. For your works seemed to give us the answer to a mystery. They filled the chasm between early Vermeers like this one and his mature masterpieces. Our search for truth and beauty blinded us, and in the end, we were all caught out.
He did a very clever thing, which was that he made Vermeers that didn't look like Vermeers, and that was really sensible. You know, if he'd done Girl with a Pearl Brooch, you could have held it up next to Girl with a Pearl, and you thought, I don't think so. But in those days, scholars believed that Vermeer had studied in Italy, which he hadn't. And so what he did was he painted a Caravaggio Supper at Emmaus in the style of Vermeer, and every, scholars who saw with their brains rather than their eyes thought, oh, well, this obviously, we can explain this like this. And people were fooled.
I would like to begin my analysis, if I may, with the Supper at Emmaus. The pigment used by Mr. van Meegeren, although chemically identical, is quite different when viewed under a microscope.
It's always easy to be wise after the event, because when you do a fake, there's something of your own time that goes into it, and later on it looks wrong.
Something that everybody wanted. And you can wait. So I'm still waiting for the self-portrait of Vermeer to appear. But you have to imagine at that point in time, so there were a lot of monographs, the documents had been published, so everybody knew that there were more paintings.
They were different from the Vermeers that we now know. They were early religious works, it was said. So Van Meegeren had tried to fill a hole in Vermeer's career.
This black substance, a dye of some sort, imitating centuries' accumulation of dirt, was used to further the illusion of age.
It's wishful thinking. It's something you really want a painting to be Vermeer. If you just want it, you know, it will be.
It's a brilliant con. You really saw what scholars were like, and they would just say, yes, you know, we've long suspected they'd be Italianate pictures. And of course, he was a Catholic, so, you know, here at last.
Very clever forgery, meaning an old canvas was used and bakelite was used, so it really had the cacolet, you know, the cacolet pattern that you see in old master paintings.
This X-ray reveals the remnants of the original painting below. A priming layer with patches of lead white paint here and here.
I do think he was brilliant, Van Meegeren. Not a brilliant painter, a brilliant, I mean, material forger, but he was just a brilliant, you know, psychologist. And of course, the next Van Meegeren that comes along and doesn't look like a Vermeer is not going to be compared with View of Delft. It's going to be compared with the last Van Meegeren.
Van Meegeren was forced to paint a Vermeer fake in front of reporters and court-appointed witnesses to show exactly how it was done.
I must thank Mr. Van Meegeren for his cooperation throughout this process. Indeed, I have never known a defendant so anxious to be found guilty.
It's very easy for us to think these people were foolish to think it is a Vermeer because it's a terrible painting.
I think many people know about Van Meegeren, but when you ask them the real story behind it, they don't know.
You do admit to painting these works?
Yes.
And selling them at the exorbitant prices charged?
If I'd have sold them cheaply, everyone would have known they were fake.
Everyone is interested in fakers, so it does give one a certain notoriety, and there is a great deal of interest in Van Meegeren, and some people like to have his work just because of who he was. So there is a certain admiration for someone who got away with it for so long.
What was it that made you continue after painting a mess? You had made your money. Why go on?
It was the satisfaction.
Of deceiving good men like Dr. Cormans? Of swindling them?
The satisfaction of perfecting my technique. I couldn't stop myself.
So money had no influence on your decision?
Money has brought me nothing but misery.
Of course, he's also very damaging to Vermeer's work, and it's important to sort out what is the real Vermeer and what are the fakes.
Han van Meegeren died soon after the trial was completed and before he served any time in prison. The forgery scandal he created showed just how hard it's been to reclaim Vermeer's legacy. But in the decades that followed, many of the genuine articles were lost to us once again in daring heists. And one is still missing. Han van Meegeren had forged numerous Vermeers for over a decade. His sensational trial in 1947 had proved an embarrassment for the scholars of Vermeer who had fallen for his deception. And as a result, one painting called A Young Woman Seated at the Virginals, which had been accepted as a Vermeer since 1904, was suddenly labelled yet another forgery. It was not until the 21st century that it started to be accepted once again.
Well, I think that is a Vermeer. I didn't think so initially, although not all of what one sees is by Vermeer, as far as I'm concerned.
There's been lots of technical analysis done in the painting and to the canvas, and I think that strongly indicates, I believe, that it is Vermeer.
She has a large yellow cloak that covers upper part of her body. You can see the tinted yellow underneath layer, and that the modeling of the underneath layer seems to me appropriate for Vermeer, whereas the modeling on the upper layer not. So I think that painting was reworked at a certain point for some reason.
Some comments could be made on the quality of, for example, the depiction of her arms, but scientifically I think it's been proven that it is part of his work, yes.
The young woman seated at the virginals suddenly became the only remaining Vermeer in private hands. All the others had become part of museum or state collections. And over the last few decades, they've been the target of some of the most notorious art thefts in history. In 1971, the Love Letter was taken from the Fine Arts Palace in Brussels, where it was on temporary exhibition. It was recovered 2 weeks later and returned to its home at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Another Vermeer that was stolen in the 1970s was the Guitar Player. Once owned by Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, this later work of the artist was taken from Kenwood House.
The Guitar Player was stolen in 1974. Kenwood House is an isolated house in Hampstead Heath, so it was a bit vulnerable at that time.
The person broke in through the window, through the shutters, into the room and stole the Vermeer specifically, ran off with it, wasn't caught. There was various theories. There's been links made to IRA and that demands were made to transfer prisoners from a prison. Also, there was a ransom note saying they were going to burn it on St. Patrick's night. However, it ended with an anonymous tip-off.
It was later found abandoned in the churchyard in Smithfields in central London.
A helpful phone call, ring, ring. Hello, you don't know me, but there's a Vermeer in your churchyard.
When I arrived here about a quarter of an hour ago, I found a lot of press here saying that the painting had been found, and of course, I was absolutely thrilled because it was so terrible that it had ever been stolen, really.
There it was, propped up against a gravestone. It was damp, but relatively unharmed.
It has slightly suffered from the atmospheric conditions while it's been away from us, and this is hardly surprising. A skilled restorer will have to see to the very slight cupping of the paint surface that has occurred.
I seem to recall that they stole some other pictures from Kenwood and dumped them down by the lake and made off. So leaving the things in the wet grass wasn't unusual for them.
Obviously not a professional thief did it. There's not much point in taking a picture and then just leaving it in a churchyard.
I should think possibly if anyone wanted to leave anything without being seen anywhere in the City of London at night, it's rather a good place because it's all very deserted. Very few people live around here, you see.
It's the only Vermeer that is still on its original or very early stretcher. So it is unique and it's very special, and we have to take, obviously, extra care of it because it's quite fragile.
This picture was on its original 17th century stretcher, and there's no mistaking that. There's no mistaking the original wooden dowels round the edge of the canvas, too. They are, of course, the pegs that Vermeer put in. Today, artists have used galvanized tacks, so we can be absolutely certain.
It's amazing that this is, still on its same stretcher from 1672.
The same year as the Guitar Player was stolen, yet another Vermeer was taken, the lady writing a letter with her maid. It's the only Vermeer in Ireland and had to endure a second theft in the 1980s.
The lady writing a letter with her maid was stolen in Ireland in the 1970s. And the IRA was involved. That was at the height of the Troubles. That was also recovered. It was stolen from Rusborough House outside Dublin.
There was a wonderful sort of figure of my childhood called Dr. Rose Dugdale, who was a sort of debutante turned IRA terrorist who, she stole it first and they found it about a week later.
I think it's unfair to say the IRA was responsible. No. At the time, Bridget Rose Dugdale and her boyfriend, Eddie Gallagher, were not just Irish nationalists, but they were paramilitary sympathizers. Their big idea was to get these things and then hold them to ransom for as much as you can establish a motive for the theft of those paintings, both in Kenwood and at Rusborough.
The painting was stolen a second time in the 1980s by a criminal from Northern Ireland, and it was recovered in Antwerp. The painting is back and now at the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin.
Fortunately, all these stolen Vermeers have been returned to their rightful homes. But one is still missing, the concert. This was taken from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, along with a painting by one of Vermeer's contemporaries, Rembrandt, in one of the most daring art thefts of all time.
The concert was taken in 1990 along with Rembrandt and a number of other important works from the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
On the night of St. Patrick's Day, 1990, 2 Boston Police Department cops turned up at the museum, banged on the door. The guys walked in, produced a gun, tied up the 2 guards, then spent several hours in the museum deciding what to take. Certainly the concert by Vermeer and also Rembrandt's Storm on the Sea of Galilee are 2 exceptionally valuable paintings, taken away over a matter of hours, and they haven't been seen since.
Most important works that are stolen do eventually turn up, but this one is now 20 or more years ago, but the hunt is still on.
The problem has been that the FBI have gone down one road, and I think there were other roads to go down.
For years, the theft has been linked to James Whitey Bulger, a notorious figure in Boston organized crime who was captured in 2011.
The Whitey Bulger story is the story. He was the kingpin. I cannot see how it's possible that Whitey did not have, either at the time or certainly soon afterwards, some connection to those paintings. However, to be fair to the FBI, there is no hard evidence of that.
Well, I've been very lucky that I've actually studied every Vermeer in the world under a microscope. I've seen it out of the frame. And the concert I spent 2 days with in that way. And I still have all these slides of the painting and all the kind of little magical ways in which these colored highlights, and it's always a huge loss that I still feel.
I hope it will come back. I hope it will come back, because for the museum it's very sad that you don't have the work itself anymore.
The hunt for the concert goes on. But it's not the only missing Vermeer that could be out there. Vermeer died in poverty, and most of his works were later auctioned off in a 1696 sale of a man called Jacob Discius, who had inherited 21 of Vermeer's paintings. Some of the works listed in the auction catalogue hadn't been found yet, and include another little street and even a self-portrait of the artist.
I'm still looking for the self-portrait that he made, because it is documented that he made one, and we know there was a second little street, like the painting in the Rijksmuseum. So maybe paintings will turn up, but it's not really the largest production.
It would be absolutely incredible. I mean, if we would be able to find one of these paintings that have been mentioned in the Discius sale in 1696 already, but have completely disappeared.
One painting that wasn't listed in the Discius sale, but has been attributed to Vermeer for a while, is the St. Praxedis. In 2014, Christie's in London auctioned the painting after announcing that technical analysis carried out at the Rijksmuseum strengthened the case that this is a genuine Vermeer.
Thank you. We move on to lot 39. Please know that there is additional literature that's been posted throughout the view. Lot 39, the Vermeer.
It may even be his earliest known work, as the lead isotope tests on the white paint of the St. Praxedis indicate that the exact same batch of white paint may have been used on both this painting and Diana and her companions.
I actually did see that painting. It was in an exhibition in Rome, I think 2 years ago. And it's a very difficult painting to attribute, because this Praxedis, a saint, she is depicted by Felice Ficcarelli, an Italian painter, and then there is a copy after that painting. And it's very difficult if there is a copy, like who made this copy.
The St. Praxedis picture is very unusual. There's a signature on it which is thought to be Vermeer's, and it appears to be a copy of an Italian painting. And there is one scholar in America, Arthur Wheelock, who believes that it's an authentic Vermeer.
I feel very strongly it is by Vermeer. And And I've had the opportunity to study that one very closely and also to see it together with the Ficcarelli painting. And to me, they're entirely different and a very different character. One very much a Dutch painting and one very much an Italian painting. And there's a lot of elements of the St. Praxedis that are consistent with early Vermeer. The complicated thing, obviously, is based on another painting. And so many of the elements of it have this Italian quality that people aren't comfortable with in Vermeer's world.
We're still hoping there will be more Vermeers, and then there is also the thing, is it a real Vermeer or not? Because that's every time a Vermeer pops up, or you'll get those questions.
At 3,200,000, 3,500,000, 3,800,000 now. At 3,000,008, yes, 4 million.
We have no other copies of paintings by Vermeer, so this will be unique if it is a full-size copy of a painting.
4,200,000, yes, 4,500,000, 4,800,000, 4,800,000 pounds.
It's unclear as to why he would have wanted to copy this particular painting, and stylistically, it's been questioned as whether it's consistent with Vermeer's work.
£5,500,000, lost chance. Sold, thank you, for £5,500,000.
Just like the lady seated at the virginals, scientific tests seem to be bringing another painting back into his canon. It's been quite a battle trying to rescue the legacy of Johannes Vermeer. Arguments will continue over the attribution of some of the paintings, including the unique St. Praxedis. But even if no new Vermeers do turn up, the few paintings we do have continue to entrance people all across the globe. The mystery of Vermeer goes on.
There's always a chance that something might emerge. I think it's a little bit unlikely at this stage because he's been famous for 100 years. But who knows, something might emerge.
I mean, you can hope. He's so well known now that I'd be surprised if something came up new that wasn't already known. But you never know in a private collection. It may appear in future years.
Today, one of the real absolute stars of what the Dutch Golden Age in painting was, but also a painter with a very tiny little oeuvre.
Once you see a Vermeer, you never forget it. And you never forget where you saw it. The Milkmaid, or you see the View of Delft, or you see the girl with the pearl earring, or you see the woman with the balance in the National Gallery, the woman in blue. I mean, you name it. It's magical to watch the power of this artist. But the most important thing is they are all such distinctive images.